Jim Colby here from Savannah Colby Outdoors. Tonight we're going to be doing some epoxy work on a customer's rod, and I'm going to walk you through the steps that I take when I'm mixing my epoxy and some of the tools that I use. So to start with, I'm using Gen 4 rod building epoxy. It's specially formulated and designed for use on fishing rods. As you notice, I have a graduated syringe. That's how I'm going to measure my epoxy. I'm using 3 mils of both the catalyst and the resin. It's very specific. If you don't use the proper amounts, they will not set up properly for you. A couple of the things I use these little medicine cups for mixing. I use a spatula, and this is what I mix my epoxy with. I have 2 different size brushes. One's a little bit wider brush, one's a little bit narrower that I use for the smaller guides. And then lastly, I like using these little metal trays. Once I mix my epoxy, I will spread it out in these trays, and that helps with any bubble release that you might have from getting more bubbles in it when you're mixing. All right. So I've already pre-measured these, 3 mils each. So I'm just gonna squirt these in the cup. So then I'm gonna use my spatula. And what I like to do is I like to put the cup in the palm of my hand. Just the heat from my hand will soften up the epoxy and make it mix a little bit better. I'm gonna mix this epoxy for a good 3 to 4 minutes to make sure that we have everything evenly distributed and we ensure that we're gonna have a good mix on our epoxy. So I'll mix for a little bit, and then I use my spatula. I scrape the sides of the cup, make sure that I don't leave any on the sides that doesn't get mixed up. And like I said, I'll do this for a good 3 minutes. I want to be careful. I don't want to mix too fast and then start inducing bubbles into the epoxy that we're going to have to contend with later. It's nice slow movements, and this Gen 4 has superior bubble release as it is, but we don't want to create more bubbles than necessary. All right, so we're going to mix this all up good, and then when we come back, we'll start applying epoxy to the rod. Hey everybody, Jim Colby here, back at the rod bench. We've got our epoxy all mixed up, and I'm going to walk you through the steps that I take when I'm applying my first coats of epoxy on a finished rod. So I've got my epoxy mixed up. I put it in my metal cup here. I've let any bubbles dissipate, and I'm going to apply my epoxy while under power. I'm going to turn it down a little bit slower, about like that is good. Now my first coats of epoxy, I want to apply pretty thin and let them soak into the threads. So I'm going to get a little bit on the brush, just dab it on the threads. And while it's under power, I'm just going to use my brush to work the epoxy back and forth. And it's pretty easy to be able to tell where you have the epoxy. You'll see it start to move. And then just use the brush to work it back and forth. And this first coat, I want it on there thin enough that I can actually still see ridges on the thread. So I don't want to oversaturate it on the first coat, and I'm also going to apply a thin layer on this entire split grip section so that I can apply decals. I always like a thin layer of epoxy down and let it cure before I apply my decals. It almost gives the appearance that your decals are floating in the epoxy. Sometimes they stand out a little bit if you apply them directly to the blank and you can see the edges. But if you put down a nice smooth layer of epoxy, let it cure, and then put your final layers of epoxy over the top of the decal, it tends to give a little bit better look. So I'm just working the epoxy and a nice smooth layer right down the blank, making sure that I have a good coat. And it takes a little bit more to cover their threads. Make sure you get enough to soak in. I have already applied a coat of a color preserver to these threads so that they don't darken up on me. Good. All right, now I'm going to use a little bit smaller brush up here on the front. Just a good coat on the threads. Now in between my hook keeper, I'm just going to put a little bit of epoxy up here, paint it back and forth. And as this rod turns, that epoxy will level out. Now on this first coat, I'm not going to go over the edge of the threads too much. I'm going to go right up to the edge. And then on my final coat, I'll go over just a little bit, make sure they got a good seal on them. All right, and then we'll complete the same process on all the rest of the guides, and we'll come back when we're doing our final